Everyone was laughing. Glasses were raised. Then my wife smiled and said, "I don't actually need you." I answered without thinking, "Then don't keep me." The room moved on, but our marriage never did. The party had been her idea. Light music, a few close friends, wine chilled too long, and the kind of forced small talk people use to pretend their lives are simpler than they are. I remember the way the light hit her hair that night, like a halo against the cheap chandelier, and the way she moved through the room with a confidence I had once loved for being contagious. We arrived together, holding hands for ritual more than necessity, and for the first hour everything was performative happiness, toasts that bubbled with sugar, jokes about work, glances exchanged like small, private insurance policies. Then she started laughing at something someone said, too loud, that laugh that reaches the eyes and makes people look up, and she leaned into the circle as if she owned the air. It was then, in the middle of that laughter, she said it, "I could leave you right now." Not a whisper, not a warning. A dare, an enormous, careless thing that dropped like ice into my chest. I didn't react the way I might have in other lives. I had learned to measure my anger, to smith it into words that kept home standing. I smiled, an odd, quiet thing. "Go ahead," I said, and the room grew very still for a single heartbeat, then returned to its clinking and chatter as if nothing had happened. But everything had. That night I drove us home in silence. She hummed along to the radio, and I watched the passing lights, as if they were pages flipping in a book I didn't want to finish. At home she kissed me, perfunctory, like sealing an envelope, and I went to bed with the warning ringing in my head like a loose wire. The weeks that followed were a study in small betrayals. A missed call evacuated as work, a text left screen locked so that I could later discover only fragments, the faint perfume under her collar that wasn't mine. When I asked, she leaned back with a practiced calm and told me I was being jealous, that I had become the one making storms out of weather. I wanted to believe her. I wanted the safe edifice of our life, the mortgage, the same dentist, Saturday errands, to remain intact. But doubt is something like a tiny, industrious animal that chews at foundations quietly until the whole thing trembles. I started watching her phone with the tenderness of a nocturnal cartographer. I watched her face in the mornings for traces of other nights. She complained about my suspicion once, called it a wall I had built, and when I tried to explain that the wall was only a response, how do you tell someone that a wall is a response to an earthquake they won't admit happened? She said nothing, which was worse. It turned out the party line wasn't merely an offhand cruelty. I found clues, notes in her handwriting that referenced meetings I wasn't invited to, restaurant reservations in other neighborhoods, social media posts liked with a regularity that felt like a ritual. Not all of it was direct proof. None of it announced itself in blunt ways, it was accumulative. Plausible deniability threaded together with intimate knowledge. At night I imagined the worst, and in daylight I tried to live with the smallest reconciliation she offered. A bouquet left on the counter, a long, embarrassing apology in a cafe over coffee that tasted like burned sugar. She would look me in the eye and swear she loved me, and I wanted those words, even if they had begun to sound like charms used to close wounds rather than heal them. I became a man who catalogued tenderness and betrayal with the same pen. The discovery, true evidence, is a violence unto itself. It is not one thing but a moment when pattern becomes proof, and proof tears the thin membrane of half-belief. I was cleaning the study, putting away a stack of mail, when an envelope fell from beneath a folder. Not mine. Her handwriting. Inside was a photo, folded, the kind you press into a wallet if you plan to lie about where you were. Two people stood wrapped around each other in a restaurant with lights softened. She was smiling in a way that belonged to someone else's private memory, and beside her was a man I did not recognize but whose hand rested on her waist the way a claim is made without witnesses. On the back a date. A place. My name was not there. There were also receipts, spending in cities 2 hours away, hotel keys with a chain dangling from a nightstand. For an instant I couldn't breathe. My mouth filled with the thick, metallic taste of reality. I confronted her in the kitchen, steadying myself against the counter as if it were the last nautical post on a ship. She put down her mug slowly, the motion casual, which only sharpened the knife. I didn't shout. There was no theater, no smashed plates, no cinematic admissions. I told her what I'd found. She looked at the photo, then at me, and for the first time since the laugh, she didn't reply with a joke. She said, "You found that?" She admitted it. But the admission fell like a stone into a pond where the ripples were a stoic "I'm sorry" and not the earthquake I had feared. She told me the man had been a complication, that it had started when she felt unseen, when our life, our routines, our calendar, had compressed into a sameness she couldn't stand. She told me it had meaning for her in ways she couldn't explain, because explanations are for the guilty, and she did not want to be dismissed as such. After the discovery, language became our battlefield in winter. Words were employed as both arms and shelter. She wanted to be honest in the way only someone asking for leniency can be honest about details enough to craft empathy, but not honest to the point of surrender. She told me things that were partial truths. The affair was not about me. It was about wanting to feel alive. It had not been physical at first, she said, but it had become so. Her narrative was slick with rationalizations. Our marriage was good in many ways. We had stability, a life, respect, and that was not nothing. Yet in every line she managed to place the blame partly on me. I had been emotionally absent. She said I had taken her for granted. There is a cruelty in such claims because they carry both apology and accusation. It recenters me as the perpetrator of the marriage's decay. I wanted to hate her, to mark her as villain. Instead I felt a complicated sorrow that crowded out simpler claims. We had shared mornings, children of our habits, and 1,000 small mercies. Who hadn't grown distant with the slow heat of obligations? Still, betrayal is arithmetic. It tallies what cannot be undone. She offered to end it. She offered to stop. She offered therapy, to move out, to take leave from work, anything that implied sacrifice except the one I secretly wanted most, to know whether she would choose me on her own if both options were whole. She insisted that the affair had been a mistake, that it had no power over her decision to come home, that she loved me. The word love became a fragile object we passed like a torch without flame. I watched her savor the relief of confessing and then watched me for absolution, as if guilt were something I could hand back to her in exchange for the intact marriage. We tried to negotiate sanity. We had rules: no contact, transparency, couples therapy, tracking time, shared passwords, a calendar with checkpoints. I told myself this measured response was dignity. She agreed with the same steadiness she'd always shown in meetings and arguments. On paper it looked like progress. But grief and betrayal do not obey spreadsheets. There were days when she would be tender, making pancakes and tracing the lines of my face with the same casual affection she had shown for years. There were other days when she would be a closed shop, curt, not meeting my eyes. When she was affectionate, I thought of the man in the photograph, an image at once intimate and dislocating. When she was cold, I thought of the empty nights. We went to therapy and sat on a small couch, two wounded animals in a room decorated with succulents. The therapist asked us to speak in turns. When she spoke, she sometimes cried, and my heart reshaped itself around that sound, protective, foolish. When I spoke, I tried to be honest and to avoid turning my testimony into a weapon. The therapist suggested exercises, each week to list gratitude, to write a letter to the younger version of ourselves, to schedule a safe hour for difficult conversations. It helped in discreet ways. It did not, however, make the image of the two of them disappear or settle the deeper questions about truth and selection. Sex became complicated, like touching in the dark after a storm. There were nights when our bodies fit together as they had, with the closeness that sometimes emerges from grief as two people band together against the future. Other nights we lay apart, and counted things like strangers. She would sometimes fall asleep with her phone in her hand, as if waiting for another call that would not come. I would watch the glow of it, and feel my chest low and hollow. I tried to reclaim intimacy by inventing rituals, taking walks, revisiting places where we had been happy, cooking our first dish together again. Sometimes this made a small bridge, sometimes the bridge collapsed under the weight of my suspicion. The danger in these negotiations was that they created a new kind of performance, hollower perhaps because each one of us could suspect the other of acting. We had been careless with the softest thing between us, the child. I had imagined that shared responsibility would be the mortar that held the house together. But children are not adhesives for adults. They are living people with their own calendars and heartbreaks. Our child, 10 years old then, had begun to notice. The child asked questions in a way that cut through our carefully calibrated sentences. Why are you sad, Dad? Does Mommy love you? Children sniff the fabric of truth like dogs. We tried to protect them, to keep our private war from spilling into homework and soccer practice. But children have an uncanny method of finding what adults attempt to hide. One evening the child followed my wife into the study, and watched her with a small frown as if she were a luggage tag left on a loved one. When the child asked about the photo I had left on the table, the explanations we offered, about adults making mistakes, about forgiveness, sounded like the same magical logic children used to make sense of death and divorce. Watching our child carry other people's confusion was a type of cruelty I had not anticipated. It was a sword in slow motion. There were moments of raw honesty with the child that I will never forget. Small confessions over cereal. Sometimes grown-ups are confused too. And homework sessions where homework became a pretext for a hug. We tried to act normal. Parents who brought sandwiches to school, parents at recitals, parents who cheered in a practice chorus. But the child had begun to ask about loyalty in ways that forced me to rewrite my own definitions. I wanted to tell them that love is a home that rebuilds itself after ruin, but that would have been a lie. Sometimes love is the reason ruin occurs. I also wanted to protect them from the truth that people they love can betray them, not because they are bad people but because humans are more porous and complicated than our moral stories allow. Who is the other man in stories like this? A nameless thing in the background, or a fully formed person with his own life and entanglements? He was no villain in the comic book sense. He had a laugh like gravel and an ordinary face. He worked late and loved jazz, or so she said. I met him once, at her insistence. She wanted to lay everything on the table. Why not meet the man who had taken a place in her heart and shook our life like a wet sheet? He arrived late, a reluctant guest. His clothes were too neutral, his hands too clean. He apologized for upsetting our family. He spoke in the conciliatory voice of someone used to boundaries and ceremony. I watched him as if I were cataloging him for an inventory of things I no longer owned. He was not monstrous. He was simply a man, with the capacity to be both cruel and kind. His apology did us no good. Apologies are only as meaningful as their consequences. Seeing them together in the picture, and then seeing him across the room, condensed an era into a single instant. Two people who had brushed against each other, and, in doing so, rewritten the map of a life. I wanted to hate him, to imagine him as a predator, but hatred is a blunt instrument, and I found instead a clinical curiosity. How did two small choices make this cathedral of our life tilt? He told me that he had not known about me initially, then later he said different things. He claimed to have loved her in ways he could not define, and then apologized with the casual grace of someone trying to make amends for an accident. He seemed stunned by the wreckage as much as we were. And in that stunned look there was a small, unbearable symmetry. None of us had intended for the house to fall so hard. We stood at the crossroads that arrives after all theatrical confessions: stay and rebuild, or leave and remake. Options have moral weight. Staying seemed like a collapse of principle, leaving like a surrender to pain. We negotiated the terms like lawyers dividing an estate. There were nights of fevered talk, mornings of silence, ballots taken in private, promises made and unmade. We considered a separation with clear terms: who would have the house, who would keep the car, how to schedule visits with the child. She said she wanted to choose us, our family, if I could forgive her. I told her forgiveness is not a switch you flip but a muscle you must train. I asked for time, for rituals of trust, for proof that she had chosen to extinguish that other life. She provided gestures and documents, and some of those gestures were sincere: deleting accounts, moving meetings, changing routines. Still, trust is not an edict, it is an accretion. The real decision arrives not in negotiated lists but in the small, domestic moments that test promises. One late afternoon I found her gaze empty as she looked at a television show we had watched together for years. A song came on, our song, and neither of us moved. In that silence I felt the old magnetism pull like a phantom limb. She reached for my hand and for a moment I felt weight and then something else. The memory of the photograph, the receipts, evenings where she had chosen to be elsewhere. She said, "I want to be with you," and I felt my throat close. It was not theater. She said it with a quiet ferocity that suggested the hunger of someone who had learned how thin the body of a life can be. I believed her then in a different way than before because there was less pleading and more acceptance. Acceptance of the damage caused, acceptance of the labor required. Choosing to stay is hard labor. We stayed. Not because of mercy, not because of bravado, but because the alternative, splitting the family and giving up on the possibility of something new, felt like a different kind of violence. We moved into a second phase where routine was a tool again. We created new rituals, not to erase the past but to learn the gestures of living with someone who had once been elsewhere. There were setbacks, an anniversary she almost forgot, a raw conversation that turned into an argument. There were also small miracles, mornings where laughter returned unbidden, her finger finding mine in the dark like relearning a path, our child falling asleep with both of us on either side like an anchor. Time passes and softens. The first year after the discovery is an acute instrument. The second year is duller but more telling. We learned to speak about the affair with a vocabulary that didn't always feel performative. I feel insecure when I need. I forgive you, but I cannot forget. She worked to rebuild trust, not as a show but as labor. She volunteered schedules, introduced me to colleagues who had been witness to the end of that other timeline, made herself accountable. I worked on my anger, on my tendency to catalog grievances. Counseling became less about confession and more about learning patterns, about mapping how we would avoid the old traps. It isn't that grief ever vanished. It remained like a scar, visible sometimes in harsh light, invisible at others. My love for her became a more complicated thing. It contained the knowledge that she had hurt me and the daily evidence that she chose us anyway. We ran into old ghosts, a friend who asked in casual cruelty whether I had ever thought of leaving, a neighbor who made a joke that was less bromide than barbed wire. There were also nights when the memory of her laugh at the party returned like a reflex, and I had to remind myself of the way she kissed me in the kitchen afterward, as if that too mattered. The child fared better than I expected. Children are resilient in ways we cannot legislate. The child found room to be both the son of broken things and a person who could still get straight A's and play on the team and have sleepovers. We maintained boundaries around the child's exposure to adult pain, and that required a vigilance that was exhausting but clear. Even as things smoothed, there were hard, quiet days, random afternoons when a smell or a song would pull me back into the panic freeze of betrayal. Sometimes the hard days turned into arguments about small things: coffee grounds left in the sink, a family event cancelled. But I noticed a change in both of us. We had fewer dramatic ruptures and more small, honest conversations. We stopped trying to get the other to feel what we felt. Instead, we learned to translate our feelings into requests. "When you don't tell me where you are going, I feel unmoored," I would say. She would reply, "I need you to tell me when you're going to be late so I don't invent stories." It is not a satisfying love to narrate like a contract, but it is survivable, and that is sometimes the highest aim. We never returned to the naive faith of our beginning. What we did instead was cultivate a new kind of cautiousness. The affair taught us that passion can be a saboteur, and that boredom is not the enemy if you remember to water the small parts of love. We discovered new ways to be intimate: reading together in the same room without devices, driving without destination, having therapy nights where we would discuss small irritations before they amassed. We also accepted that sometimes love is simply an act of showing up. She showed up, on gray mornings, on birthdays, at school recitals. She took the side of the family publicly, with honest gestures that mattered to everyone who watched. Those gestures did not undo what she had done, but they created a new testimony to the shape of her willingness. There were nights when I thought of leaving again, rare, sharp desires like splinters. Each time I had to ask myself if my leaving would be vengeance masquerading as liberation or a reasonable step to protect my dignity. I thought about the practicalities, the child, the neighborhood, the life we had built, and I thought about the internal ledger of love and pain. Choosing to stay became an active verb, a daily decision to negotiate pain and to reward the parts of our life that were not yet ash. Over the years the wound became less jagged. It remained a contour of a person, an indentation you can see if the light hits, yet we made new rooms out of our old house. We built accountability into our calendar in less clinical ways: lunches alone, weekends for the two of us without phones, little rituals that had no declared purpose besides to be together. Our sex life, once disrupted, returned with a steadier, quieter flame. It was less theatrical, more trustworthy. I learned to ask for what I needed. She learned to say no when she needed boundaries. We both learned to be smaller with our egos and larger with our patience. Sometimes I would see someone at a cafe and my chest would tighten with a flash of the old jealousy. Sometimes she would tell me a story about a time before we met, and I would find myself smiling for reasons that had nothing to do with betrayal. The child grew into adolescence, and with adolescence came new struggles unrelated to our drama. Being responsible for another human being taught me the value of continuity over purity. There are things worth preserving even when they are compromised. When I look back, I see how fragile the story of marriage is, how easily it can be reauthored by an extra person, by boredom, by hunger for an unnameable feeling. I also see how the capacity to stay, to repair, is not always noble. Sometimes it is pragmatic, tethered to children and mortgages. But pragmatism does not eliminate tenderness. Sometimes staying is an act that births tenderness later, because tenderness requires the safety that only time can grant. I do not forgive as quickly as the movies. I forgive in increments, with receipts and conversations and rituals. Forgiveness, for me, became a practice of choosing the person again in 1,000 small ways rather than in a single declaration. There are people who will say I was a fool to stay, that I traded dignity for a broken promise. There are others who will say I was brave. Labels like coward or hero are not useful when you are inside a life. The only question that matters is whether you can live there and remain whole enough to be a good parent, a good partner, and a decent human. We are all, in the end, messy. We are both the architects and the vandals of our lives. The affair taught me humility about my own capacity to be betrayed and about my own capacity to forgive. There are small triumphs that do not look like triumphs. A morning when she fixed the coffee exactly how I like it without being asked. A weekend where we both remembered to attend a recital. The child bringing home a drawing of our family that included both parents smiling. These are not cinematic reconciliations, they are the slow accrual of normalcy. They whisper that repair has happened in ways that are either perfect nor total. Every once in a while I catch her watching me, really watching me, in the way that once made my heart beat fast at 25. She no longer lives in the imagery of another life. She has planted herself in our small places and tends them with an attentiveness that is both contrition and love. That laugh at the party will always be a hinge. It is a marker of how quickly casual cruelty can become a life-changing event. But I learned that love is not a static property. It's a series of tendencies that can shift and be rehearsed. I learned that we can be both the cause and the solution to our own misfortunes. I learned that people make mistakes not because they want to be cruel, but sometimes because they are searching for pieces of themselves they don't know how to name. I also learned that choosing someone after betrayal is less about erasing the past than about choosing the future, small, imperfect, and stubbornly mundane. One late summer evening years later, the three of us, my wife, our child, and I, sat on the back porch eating cold pizza and watching the streetlights come on. It was the sort of ordinary moment that had once seemed impossible, laughter without edges, a joke about the dog who had learned to fetch slippers, the child telling us about a crush at school. My wife nudged me and said quietly, "Thank you for staying." The words were simple, honest, and huge. I thought of the photo folded in that old envelope, and of the nights of therapy, and the small labors of rebuilding. I said I stayed because there was still you, and because I wasn't certain I could do better alone. She reached for my hand and squeezed it like a vow that had been rewritten. It was not the end of anything dramatic. It was a quiet admission of mutual repair. We are not a perfect family. There are days when the old past comes back and I must remind myself why I stayed. There are also days when I look at her and feel gratitude for the work we did together. Repair is not closure, it's a continuum. We keep at it through small rituals, through honesty, and by protecting the child from the worst of our adult mistakes. The story did not end with a movie-style reconciliation, and it did not end in a clean divorce. It became, instead, a long experiment in whether two people who had once been broken could build something durable from the fragments.